Hi everyone. Today I'm going to talk with you about the most common type of sequence, the descending fifth progression. And it sounds a little something like this. To begin, let's remind ourselves of some strong types of harmonic motion between chordal roots in Western art tonal music. Consider the following progression. Roman numeral and contextual analysis tells us that we have a strong predominant dominant tonic paradigm, the phrase model, and we see that the melody rests on tonic, giving us a perfect authentic cadence. We might notice a few voice leading things, such as chordal sevens behaving as they should, that is, resolving downward by step when the harmony changes, and also things like a root position chord being left incomplete because of its root position sort of structure. If we examine a little bit more closely at the chordal roots, we see some things we already know. A 5 chord going to a tonic chord yields a bass or root motion of a falling fifth. Backing up a step, we might see the intervallic inversion of a falling fifth, that bass motion moving up an ascending fourth. And if we consider that to be the same type of motion as a falling fifth, which we should, then we can say that a 2 chord is a stronger predominant than, say, a 4 chord. And the reason is twofold. One reason is this falling fifth relationship between the root of A to D. The second is the common tone that gets created via that relationship, in this case A natural. And then to kind of foreshadow some other discussions later about sequences, there is a strong motion here as well, which is ascending by a step, 1 going to 2, a very common type of motion. So now let's see what happens when we take this idea of a falling fifth and we cast it into repetition and patterning. The key signature is changed to 1 flat, and there's a C sharp at the end of the excerpt, which tells me that maybe D minor is what's going on. And if we look at measure 2, we might see a C natural in the bass voice. Now, a C natural is not necessarily what I expect in D minor, but it's possible. For now, I'm just going to ask you to acknowledge it, and we'll come back to it in a moment. The voices are laid out in a simple first species counterpoint with the intervals analyzed in between. So you might notice that measure 1 and 2 bear a striking resemblance to one another. We have a sort of 10th followed by an octave, and then another 10th followed by another octave, and then a 10th, and then after that we get a little bit of a pattern that breaks. So this is what we refer to as the model and the sequential legs, or the sequential copies, or what I'll just label as sequence. So we have a model that's established with 2 harmonies, and then we have a repetition of that, but it's transposed. It's moved to a different diatonic pitch level. In this case, what started on D restarts on C, and then restarts again on B flat. In other words, everything seems to be going down by a step, at least from measure to measure in this context. And you might notice that measure 3 breaks that pattern. That octave becomes a 6th. And this is what I tend to expect with sequences in general. Sequences establish something, and then repeat it at a different pitch level, and then usually initiate it again before breaking. Sometimes it goes on longer, but that's usually what I expect as a bare minimum for something that I can consider to be a sequence, is this sort of repetition of the pattern that goes on. So if we look at it, we see, okay, there's this octave followed by this 10th, and then it happens again in measure 2, and then that 10th initiates measure 3. So that 10-8 seems to be pretty important to how we can think about this and analyze this. So that sort of intervallic relationship is what we call a linear intervallic pattern, or LIP for short. Now, the LIP tells us a lot of useful information. It helps us identify where models and sequential legs happen in terms of analysis, and it also helps us kind of understand and conceptualize how sequences kind of work. So in this case, the linear aspect of it is we have 2 lines going on. The melodic line, and then the bass line. So we have this sort of linear aspect of that. We have 2 different lines happening. And then there's 2 different harmonies going on within each measure, or within each model and sequential copy, in other words. And we can see this sort of patterning of 10, 8, 10, 8, 10. And that's what we call the linear intervallic pattern. And of course, intervals can tell us a lot about harmonies. In this case, it looks like we're moving from a D minor chord ultimately to a predominant and then toward a dominant chord at the very end. So if we're looking at this anyways, you might notice that there's some curious Roman numerals here. In particular, measure 2 looks a little strange. A 7 chord, subtonic, major, followed by a 3 chord. Okay, not that uncommon. Then a 6 chord, okay, sure, and then 2 to 5. So then you might also acknowledge there's parentheses going on. Now we've used parentheses in the past to state that something is non-functional. And that's what sequences are. Sequences are a combination of things, a repetition of intervallic patterning, creating a model in sort of sequential copy relationship, and then also these chords that kind of connect point A to point B. In this case, the progression is really going from a D minor chord to a 2 chord toward a 5 chord. But in between, we have all this other stuff that expands this sort of phrase model from within. So that's what's going on here. We have a series of non-functional chords, which is exactly why we see C natural instead of something like C sharp in measure 2. C sharp is about functionality. The leading tone creates function in terms of D minor. C natural robs that leading tone of its functionality. And now we see just a generalized pattern that goes on. So in other words, sequences take the diatonic form and don't use any accidentals until you want to break the sequence. Breaking out of the sequence is where we start to get leading tone and normative sort of chordal functions again. So if we look at the chord relationships between roots, we can see the falling fifth pretty clearly. 1 moving to 4 is a falling fifth relationship. 7 moving to 3, C to F, is another falling fifth relationship. And then B flat, if it was falling to E natural, would be another falling fifth. In this case, that chord is broken and inverted. But we still have the same sort of root motion of a falling fifth. And we know that the inversion of a falling fifth is an ascending fourth. So this is what happens when you cast a chord progression with descending fifth patterning to it. We see that D natural moves to G natural, which moves to C natural, which moves to F natural, which moves to B flat, and so on. That's what we're talking about with a descending fifth sort of pattern that's happening here. Returning to the contextual analysis, all that non-functionality stuff, it's just tonic expansion, the same sort of reason that if it just went 1 to minor 4, back to 1, we know that that's non-functional stuff, and this is the same sort of treatment of it. We also saw C natural maybe cast into something like a lament progression before. Pardon my playing. That C natural in that case was a minor 5 chord in first inversion that we also put in parentheses, indicating its non-functional status because it doesn't have a leading tone. So then lastly, we can map one other concept onto this, and it's another sort of labeling that I find useful. You might not find it useful, but I find it useful. And it comes from Steve Lates, as far as I can tell, in his textbook, The Complete Musician. So we might notice that all these patterns have, or the model to sequence pattern, everything goes down by a step from measure to measure. So that's where we get the D2 from, the model to sequential leg patterning. Everything goes down a step. And then the -5 + 4 relationship is essentially telling us chord roots, that the base motion or the root progression motion is descending by a fifth each time. And if the model to the leg is going down by a step, one way to do it would be to go down a fifth and then come back up a fourth. So that's what that D2 -5 + 4 is telling us. Ultimately, this is all a descending fifth progression. And by writing this progression out in 4-voiced keyboard style, we can see a little bit clearer what these harmonies are actually doing here and what chords are actually present. In terms of voice leading, just notice that if you write the model to the first copy without any sorts of issues, parallel this or that. The rest of it tends to be pretty simple, copy paste. If, on the other hand, you write an error into that model and the first copy and then repeat it, you'll repeat the same error over and over again, like a parallel fifth or parallel octave, etc. So just strive for good consistency for the first iteration of it, and then the rest is kind of cut and dry. Write it and go with it that way. So now let's look at what happens in terms of ways to embellish this and maybe change our 10/8 LIP but keep the same chord progression. Moving back to counterpoint terms anyways, looks like now we have an embellished version with a little bit more of a disjunct contour, and it gives us a little bit of a different effect. Now, in terms of what's different, well, we can see what's different. The texture is different, and also some intervals are different. But other things are the same. The model and the sequential legs still just replicate down by step. Nothing else has changed about that, and the third measure still has the same sort of breaking aspect to it. The cadence is slightly decorated. I just felt like I needed to do that. So then, what's different about it? Well, the linear intervallic pattern is now different. What was 10/8, where the melody went, now it's essentially more disjunct. So essentially we have this sort of falling fifth happening in the bass voice, but also in that melodic voice between each chord. And well, what's going on in between? We still have the same harmonic relationships. Really, the main thing about this that's different is that we just have a chord skip that's kind of articulating a little bit of difference with it. And that's essentially it. We still have a descending fifth pattern, everything moving down by step, and each harmony is still descending by a fifth. So D down to G, down to C, down to F, and so on. Let's change the key and see what else we can come up with. Key signature is now 1 sharp, indicating G major, and compound duple looks like the metric structure. A 1 measure model is transposed down a step and copied as a sequential leg, which is then transposed down a step in measure 3 and copied again as a sequential leg. That's where that D2 comes from, and that is the interval of transposition. The model is transposed down a step, copied, and then that copy is transposed down a step, copied again. So then, you might notice that we're not dealing with a 10/8 intervallic pattern or a 10/10 intervallic pattern. Now it's 10/6. So what we are looking at here is essentially a 10/6 linear intervallic pattern. Now that 6 tells us a little bit of information. It tells us that that second harmony in each instance is probably a first inversion chord. So if we look at this, we can see, okay, we have first inversion chords happening every other harmony, and looks like we have non-functionality still. You might ask yourself a question about, where does that non-functionality really stop? Because in this case, 2/6, it's following the pattern pretty much precisely as the preceding measures. And this is something that people might do differently from person to person. All I really care about is that the non-functionality ends somewhere and that we're consistent about it. In this case, I wanted to include 2/6 as a predominant structure, and therefore I can give a predominant label. If that 2/6 is going to be considered part of the pattern still, then that's fine. We can put it in parentheses, but it's not going to be a predominant function then. This reinforces the idea that sequences take us from point A to point B. It takes us from tonic to predominant in this case, but depending on how we analyze it and think about it, it could take us all the way to the dominant. But again, I wanted to include 2/6 in terms of my predominant structure. So then between chords, we can still see the same relationship unfolding if we're thinking about chord roots. G major moving to C, that's going down a fifth. You notice the bass motion is just descending a third here. But it's not to say that this is a descending third sequence, it's a descending fifth sequence, because the harmonies, the roots of those harmonies are moving by a fifth and a fourth with each instance. Now you might ask yourself a question about measure 2 beat 1. That seems a little curious, a root position diminished triad, because we know that a diminished triad found in root position anyways emphasizes the dissonance in the structure. Usually with diminished triads, we find them cast into maybe first inversion. Because when they're in first inversion, it emphasizes the consonants within the chord, a third and a sixth. So because of the overall intervallic patterning that's going on, with each chord falling by a fifth in terms of its harmonic position, and overall the model and sequential copies going down by a step, we see some things that might strike us as curious if the music was functional, but doesn't strike us as curious because of the overall non-functional position of a sequence as a phrase expansion. So in other words, in minor mode, we said it's a little curious to see a subtonic chord out in the open like that. But because of the pattern, we saw, oh, this is something that's really common and it makes a lot of sense. And then the leading tone gives us our functionality back and boom, we're back in whatever key we're in diatonically. Now in major mode, we're not going to take the leading tone and lower it or anything like that because that would just pull us out of our diatonic key area, it would make it sound foreign, and it would also basically remove the idea, if we're talking about sequences as being something that connects point A to point B and expands the phrase model from within, well, being diatonic is an important part of that. So we don't necessarily expect that leading tone to be robbed of its position and moved to subtonic or anything like that. So we can still expect to find leading tones. But just like in the minor variant, we'll see the leading tones maybe not behaving appropriately. In this case, we see it forming a diminished triad in root position, and even more so, it's a doubled leading tone. And even more so, neither of them resolve up to tonic at any point in this progression. So this just serves us as our reminder that the goal of this whole entire idea of sequential patterning is where it goes at the end. That predominant, but that dominant at the end, that 5 chord. That's the most important part about this. So then here's what this sequence sounds like when cast into 4 voices. Alright, so now what happens if we add a little bit more to these sequences? Something like maybe sevenths. The key signature, 2 sharps, and an A sharp at the end. That tells me B minor might be the way that this is working here. So we still have a model followed by a sequential copy and then another sequential copy. And everything is still going down a step, so that D2 is still holding up as our interval of transposition. But now we see a little bit of a different linear intervallic pattern. We see that octave followed by a fifth in terms of what's happening within the model and then what's copied afterward. And that 8/5 LIP could pose problems if that upper voice was doing some leaping, but right now the upper voice is moving stepwise. This actually doesn't violate any voice leading procedures. If we look at the chord progression, Roman numeral, contextual analysis, but then we can see a little bit of what we've already seen before. A 4 chord moving to a major 7, moving to a major 3. Each one is a little bit decorated because it involves a 7th. And those 7ths, as long as they're behaving as chordal 7ths ought to, in other words, going down by step when the harmony changes, they are going to be functioning the same way that we expect them to function normally. And we can also take this opportunity to remind ourselves that no matter how the bass voice looks, that -5 plus 4, we're really talking about the harmonies, going down a fifth, up a fourth, down a fifth, up a fourth. That's essentially why I'm going to always kind of label them consistently -5 plus 4. I'm always going to go minus plus when I'm labeling these things, but you might see bass lines that look a little different, even though they're not quite that different. So then we can actually put a 7th on every one of these harmonies. We could do something like the same chord progression, but we can just keep adding 7ths throughout, and as long as they're still functioning the way we expect them to, then all is well in 4-part writing land. So those those sevenths really come out pretty clearly and are used pretty consistently in these sorts of sequences in general. So we still have a model sequencing happening, same things, just all with a seventh added to it. So then recapping, sequences in general. A series of non-functional harmonies, that's what the parentheses are for, and within each one of these models and legs, we see an LIP. And we're talking about an interval per chord. Specifically about descending fifths, each chordal root is falling by a fifth, or ascending by a fourth, but that's what we're looking at in terms of their harmonic motion. Each pattern then between the model and each copy is descending by a step.